Sabah el khair, everybody. If you are in the United States, it's morning out here in California. And let's see where everyone else is. Today on City Sunday, we are going to talk about, like, here I am all chipper, and it's like, oh, we're going to talk about understanding trauma within the Middle East. Yeah, that's not a very, that's a pretty heavy topic. So I am going to ensure that all of us on this live, my hope is that we can participate. So let's start by seeing where everyone is. Anybody in the community for International Arab want to share where you are coming in from? I'll start first. I'm here from California. And so one of the things I want to talk about is my name is Tiffany Toda. I'm a Palestinian American marriage and family therapist. And I have been working with Arabic communities for many, many years. I've worked in trauma, just beginning the trauma work actually within our communities. However, I do have a long, extensive history in working with childhood trauma in particular. So let's see, where is everybody at? Hi, Mira, it's good to see you. Good morning. And where are you coming from? Anybody want to share before we dive into what we're going to talk about today? All right, well, let's see. Egypt. All right, Egypt's in the house. You know, I wanted to thank all my Egyptian supporters. Man, Egypt is coming out real strong. So I wanted to thank each and every one of you that come from Masad. Thank you for supporting this community and sharing all your words of wisdom. So I appreciate that. Anybody else that's joined the live that wants to tell us where you are from? Anybody from Palestine in the house? Being a Palestinian American, I always love seeing people in Palestine. Anybody in Lebanon, Syria? Where is everybody joining in from? Thank you everyone who's joining this live. Hey, Egypt's in the house, love it. All right, anybody else? We're gonna talk about trauma today, everyone. A very heavy topic. I'm gonna try and make it as light as possible. Oh, hi, France. All right, Europe's in the house. Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much. Anybody else, please feel free to join in and let me know where you're from. Algeria, welcome. This topic is very multi-layered in really thinking about how I'm going to approach it. I'll be honest. Hey, Indonesia, welcome. Today we're going to talk about understanding trauma within the context of Middle Eastern culture. Now, for those of you that are joining in from Indonesia or France or other countries, please know this is for Middle Eastern people within this context. However, welcome. If you can gain what you can from it, great. Whatever I say in here, take what you want, get rid of the rest. Okay, so what doesn't apply, let it fly. The reason why I talk about that is trauma is so unique to each and every person. So I'm going to give us some generalities. I'm going to give us some language, some things for you to think about as we're talking about this topic. If you're feeling triggered or if it gets really heavy, just get off the live, give yourself a break, because for many people within our culture, I can say, everyone, many times when I'm doing an assessment, I'll say any trauma in your history. Most Arab that I work with will say, no, I don't have any trauma in my history. Then I realized I need to change the word trauma to pain and suffering. Because many times we grew up where these very intense and extreme situations were negated, ignored, not talked about. And so there was a tendency to minimize that. So let's talk within you, pain and suffering. What are the events that have caused you pain and suffering? Now, the reason why I talk about within our cultural context, why I talk about this is because it is so multi-layered. It is extremely complex to talk about trauma within our cultural context. Cultural context has a huge impact on how we approach trauma. Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Many times we negate this. And that's why Western therapy for Arabic or Middle Eastern communities typically doesn't work, or it's not as effective. Or people come to me and they say, Tiffany, I went to Wahda Amerikaniya, I went to an American therapist, and she was like, cut off your family. All these things that are not within our cultural context. Okay. So today we're going to talk about it through our lens. And this means anybody, I'm asking a call to action to each of you. Please participate. If you feel comfortable to share your thoughts. Let us come together as a community so others don't feel so alone. First, I wanted to honor, the phone fell. First, I wanted to honor and acknowledge all the mental health practitioners throughout the Middle East, particularly in Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Sudan. I cannot imagine the amount of trauma you have witnessed and experienced while helping our communities survive. So thank you. Thank you to anyone in the medical profession, anybody helping our communities. To the Middle Eastern mental health therapists in the diaspora, let's keep doing our part to preserve our cultures and our community. I get emotional because we need to come together, ma'wahad, to stay uplifted and break generational trauma as trauma is occurring. So it's like, what do we do with all this? What do we do? And I'm saying, let's just start small. Let's start today by talking about trauma. Now, Dr. Gabor Mate, for anyone who's interested, does really good work, and he defines trauma as, trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. So what does that mean? What does that mean? It's about a journey within yourself to say, I have experienced all these things. How does that shape how I move in the world today? How does it shape it? Now, trauma is not solely defined by the external events, but rather by your internal psychological and physiological response to those events. And that begins with awareness within yourself. That's why I say trauma, we're going to heal collectively. However, it's an individual journey for you to understand yourself better. And that takes a lot of time and a lot of work. With that said, think of it as a wound that's created within you. So if you see a jar, and you put a rock in it, and there's a small rock in it, this wound is a part of you. Now, our work in here and your work for you is to ensure that you create more space in your life so that that wound will always be a part of you, but you're creating more space so that the wound doesn't consume you. Many times it impacts our emotional health, how you express your feelings, strong social support network, managing stress, healthy boundaries. Emotionally, how is your suffering impacting you? Cognitively, any trauma that you may have experienced in your life may impact your attention, your memory, your reasoning and logic, that cognitive part of your brain, how you process things. So what does that mean? If you say, gosh, today I can't think, I have brain fog, it's hard for me to focus, know that that could be a physiological response to the distress surrounding your trauma. It can affect your physical being, sleep, your hygiene, your illnesses, if you're prone to illnesses or autoimmune or these types of things. We've seen studies, a direct correlation between chronic stress and medical health issues. So let's talk about the range of trauma. Now, I know let's see, let me look at the comments and see. Okay, yes, okay, here we go. I'm not going to pay attention to the comments just yet unless people have something relevant to share. So let's talk about trauma. It can range from significant life-altering events or situations. Life-altering events or situations. We call them big T's. So think about your life. What big T's have you experienced? What would be some big T's Middle Eastern people face? What would be, if anyone can chime in, being from the Middle East, what would be some large, big traumas where there are significant, life-altering, threatening events? Well, those from Palestine, the current genocide that's occurring, that is a huge life-altering, threatening event. Occupation is a life-altering, threatening event and situation. Any acts of violence can be construed with that. What do acts of violence mean? If you've been physically harmed, assaulted in any way, incarceration. So these are the big T's that I'm referring to and talking to. Rape, war, neglect. Those are big T traumas, big T's. Anybody else want to share big T's? Witnessing violence, witnessing death. The death of a parent or a family member can also be a big T. And so asking yourself, have I experienced any significant life-altering events? Now, anybody from the countries that I've mentioned, I can tell you, all of you, depending on where you live, well, in general, because you may have witnessed it, you're a part of it, big T trauma, big T. This is why so many within our community struggle with anxiety. I do lots of videos on that. And many times it comes from the big T chronic traumas that they are enduring. Now, for those of you that may not live in these countries, let's talk about, or maybe you live within these countries, however, are not directly impacted by child abuse. Yes, thank you, Raven Blackwood. Thank you so much. Absolutely, child abuse can be construed as a big T trauma. And child abuse includes verbal abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and sexual abuse. Also, children that witness domestic violence or intimate partner violence can also be construed as a big T or a big trauma. All right, so let's talk about little T's. Now, little T's are typically not life-threatening or physically violent, but they cause emotional distress and disruption of a person's life. Now, I do a lot of videos on how to be parents. Now, I know we're going to talk about our how to be parents trauma and how that impacts that generational trauma. However, for you, if you had challenging parents, challenging community, where there's emotional distress because of these cultural norms, expectations, and let's go over some things around that. Not being married by a certain age, not having children. Anybody else want to chime in and talk about what are some little T's you may have experienced? Not choosing a partner your family expects. We're not going to solution, Ahmad. We're not there yet. We need understanding first. The Arab aren't, in my experience, we are not ready for solutions. We need understanding first of our nervous system, of what is happening to us. We tend to slide over all this. But with that said, thank you for your question. I will go over some solutions at the end of the live. not choosing a career your family wants, not having the physical attributes that may be acceptable to cultural norms and expectations. Oh, inti casita, or into this, or inti that, or you're too big, or you're too, all the body shaming. And I can get, that my mother was she is a beautiful woman. And yet her whole life, she was told, inti casita. So what did she internalize? Not her beauty. She internalized that she was short. Now, these are these emotional distresses about how you see yourself and how this was impacted by the people in your life. And that those all can be construed as little t's. Yet ihna, in general, we dismiss them. Oh, it's me. I'm the one. Yes, you could take responsibility and accountability for how these little t's have impacted you. And you can recognize where they come from. Breakups or relationships, conflicts in divorce, conflicts within your relationships, whether they're with your siblings, your parents, your cousins, your partner. A huge one, fleeing one's country. So now you must flee what you know, flee your country, or leave your country because of marriage or a job. Now you're in another country where you may not know the language, you may feel isolated, you're displaced. It completely shatters your sense of grounding. And that can be, I would dare say that I would move that into a big T. Even though it may not be life-threatening, it can completely jolt your nervous system when you experience this. Here we go. Hearing criticism. How many of us grew up hearing criticism? What would be some things that you were criticized for? Okay, let's talk about that. How many of you were criticized for anything growing up? What would be some examples of criticism? Because many times we internalize this criticism, again, in how we see ourselves. Yes, my failure in academics, that is a huge one. Now, what does failure mean, or setbacks in academics? Typically within our culture, unless you're what? Mohandas, Doctor, Mohami, all of a sudden you're an academic failure, but maybe you are excellent at writing or creating or teaching. And so now you see yourself as a failure, but maybe you are not a failure. Maybe it's just something that doesn't resonate with you as far as a career choice, but yet the culture will instill that in you, that you are an academic failure. I know we don't like to talk about, the death of a pet. Now, again, we minimize these impacts when the unconditional love of a pet, no matter what it is. I've heard horrific childhood trauma stories of my cousins, myself, where we had a fish, a rabbit, a dog, a cat, and then we're connected to this animal, and all of a sudden, or the bird, and all of a sudden the animal, no animal. We're like, you're a little kid. You're like, what happened to my pet? Now, I know this feels maybe silly or contrite in the bigger scheme of the bigger wounds that I'd have to go through, but I want to highlight for you how these little traumas can impact you if you had a pet that your parent just got rid of, or it died and they didn't talk to you about it. These are things that can impact you today. Being rejected by a friend group or not being accepted into a community. So working with either, if you're a Palestinian refugee in another country, right? You may not be Lebanese enough or Jordanian enough, or you might not feel like this sense of belonging. This is a common theme I hear, that there's not this acceptance within the community group. If you're from the LGBT community within our Middle Eastern culture, you may be rejected, in some cases harmed, by not being who they expect you to be. I would dare to say that may move into a big T trauma. These are things we don't talk about as a culture, and how we reject, or how we have been rejected from a community if we didn't fit their norms. All right. There is evidence consistently that repeated exposure to little traumas, so that long laundry list I gave you guys, can cause more emotional harm than exposure to one big T traumatic event. So think about that. Think about how many little traumas you have in your life. Now layer it with the big T. And one of my coined phrases are, it's a wonder Arab are functioning to the degree that we do as a society. That is one of our strengths, is that in spite of all this trauma, all this multi-layered trauma, we can still rise. We can still uplift one another. We can still create community. We're still kind and generous and loving, even in spite of all these intense political upheaval, emotional distress. It's incredible. So these are the strengths. So I think someone said, well, what's the solution? I have no idea what the solution is because it's so multi-layered. But one thing I can't say, we, each and every one of us, are a part of this solution by looking within ourselves and healing ourselves, and then sharing perhaps this content or letting other people know, hey, I'm healing. Or if someone talks about a traumatic event, we're not like, malash, insa, forget it, or minimize it, but to hold space for one another and say, yeah, that's hard. And sit in the discomfort of bearing witness to one another's pain and suffering. And it's uncomfortable. And it's challenging. And so if we want to heal, and if we want solutions to how we can grow and expand as a community, guess what? We need to stay present to what is happening within us. So I want to share a story. I mentioned many times before, we normalize abuse. We have lots of comedy content creators who make all these jokes about our trauma. Now, my cousins and I, we would sit around and joke around. When we were kids, we would joke around our physical abuse. Now, I grew up in the 70s, so corporal punishment was normal back then. Belts, sticks, shoes, filfil. They would put filfil in our mouth. And we would say, whose father's initials, because Arabi men typically will have these gold rings with their initials on it, would be created on our fat lip. What belt caused the most harm? Now, I'm sorry if this is triggering for people, but we were laughing about it. We were joking about it. We'll say, whose dad or whose mom abused the worst? And it wasn't until we would joke about it with our non-Arabi friends where they would look horrified that this is what we had to go through. Okay? Now, this is for you to gain an understanding that this is nothing to joke about. Now, we can make light because sometimes that will help alleviate some of the stress, but these things have significant impacts on all of us. Okay? And then it impacts our children and our children's children. So part of this community for International Arab is for us to come together and say, I'm going to stop this for the next generation. And if you're young, 18, 19, 20, 24, I'm letting you know, heal now. Get the tools now. And this community is here for you to be able to begin an understanding that all these things that you're going through are not normal. They are not meant to be minimized. They have impact on you. It's up to you to figure out what type of impact it has on you and to get the help that you need. And how do you get the help that you need? So let me take a look at some of the comments here. Yeah, so whenever I tell my mom that I'm struggling, thank you, Raven, for sharing this, and I appreciate your courage in speaking to this, is she tells me to go pray more. Now, spirituality and religion may have a part of your healing. However, it may not be enough, that there may be more practical tools that you may need to regulate your emotion, to regulate your body, to be able to go and do those things. Sometimes your memory and your brain is scrambled, and you cannot organize yourself enough to do these things. And I'm letting you know that's okay, and that's normal. That may be one path, but you may need to do a couple more steps before you move ahead in that. Now, let's continue to talk about this degree of trauma. Now, in order for us to live healthy lives and heal these wounds, what does that mean to you? Does it mean you need to revisit all these traumatic events? No, it does not necessarily mean you need to revisit all these traumatic events. It's in the sharing of the story. And that could be you sharing the story for yourself. Writing your story in a journal. Talking about the things that have happened to you. Finding a close friend that you can share. Somebody you feel safe with to be able to share your story. Reaching out to gain understanding. That your parent, now, excuse me, when your mother was pregnant with you, and if she was under duress during the pregnancy, that this is where there's a lot of studies with what we call pre to 3, so before birth, up to 3 years old, your mother's, how she was regulated, how she was able to, her stress levels directly impacted you. So for many of you who grew up in war, intensity, your mother was pregnant with you, out the womb, you may have already a distress response. This is not blaming mom at all. For you to understand that your stress levels out the womb were already compromised. And so what do you do with that? And then on top of your upbringing. So it's about being patient with yourself, offering yourself grace, and knowing that it's not easy. And we like to rush everything. Rush. You cannot rush trauma. You cannot rush this healing of trauma. This is where it's focusing on yourself and giving yourself grace of saying, oh, I got triggered. Oh, what was happening within me that I got triggered? All right, let's keep going. All right, so try and talk to your parents around, if they're open. If they're not, don't push this. Talk to your parents, your grandparents, your aunties, your uncles around their stories. Because their stories will be a gateway into your generational trauma and in your experience. I'm just going to see here some comments. That's right. Thank you, user long numbers. In Arab communities, sharing deep feelings with others, even family, sometimes is considered weakness. Yes, that is a cultural message that if you share your feelings, you are weak. This is why I say use discernment in who you share your feelings with. This is about the ones that are open, that are not going to see it as a weakness. If anything, and I did a video on this, it's not soft or weak to lean into your feelings. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to tap into what is happening with you. a lot of courage. And people will be terrified of that because that means they would have to look within their feelings and their trauma. And for our parents, that might be too much for them. I remember when I was in graduate school doing my marriage and family therapy, and you know, the Western way is, oh, talk and find out and go. So of course I go to my teta and I go, Teta, let's talk about anxiety and this and that. And she goes, we don't have anxiety, Teta. We're just nervous, she would say. And I would say, Teta, but this is something that's been happening for a long time. Intimate partner violence, domestic violence, the lineage of that. So it stopped with me. No more. My daughter will never know that trauma because I had to do the work. But in my teta sharing her stories and in her being open and gently telling me I thought, oh my gosh, this woman was such a survivor. I thought she was anxious and nervous, and she was. But once she shared her stories, I said, oh my gosh, Teta, you are an incredible survivor. And I found strength in her story. I found that strength. And you can too. But you need to use discernment in who you can talk to. Sometimes our moms or dads may be ready to share their immigration stories or what happened to them when they were younger. Maybe they talk about the nice stories first, and that may lead to other experiences that they've had. We know, within your family system, if there's a vehement opposition to you sharing, that there may be something there in your family history that they don't want to talk about. And one of the things why I created this community is that if you can't share your story with anybody in your family, you can share your stories here. We all have stories. And what are we doing with those stories? Can we use these stories to weave in our strength the way I weaved in my teta strength within me? Or Siddhi, who's the honor of Siddhi Sunday, because she shared with me her story and gave me strength to say, keep going, Teta. Keep going, Habibti. Don't let what happened to us affect you. We are here, Ijina Almerca, to give you a different life. And they did. As hard as it was being a first generation American with the discrimination and all these things that we were, the racism and the isolation and all these things we had to deal with being in this country. And then we would go back home. We weren't Arabi enough. Arabi. It was like you didn't belong here. You didn't belong there. And then what happened? Again, your identity and these are all these little traumas. And what do you do with that? How did it affect you? How do we create community? How are these traumas woven into each and every one of us? Because we are all connected. As Indigenous people, we are connected to the land. So what happens there, we feel it no matter where we are. And those that are in the land who are experiencing distress, how can we support you? How do we continue to rise in strength, in peace, in love, in compassion? And that begins with understanding how the brain and the body works and responds to big T and little t trauma. So let's move into more of the mechanics of trauma and how it may impact your body. The body and brain have specific responses to traumatic events. Some of you have already heard it's the body's way of protecting us or preparing us to confront a threat. So like if you hear a loud noise, immediately you're looking, you're scanning to see where the threat is. You hear the loud noise, your body. So many of us within our culture, Arab, we tend to be very jumpy. Like every time if there's a noise or a stranger entering the room, or we're what we call hyper vigilant, we are scanning the room for threats. So that could be in your workplace, That could be in your relationships. Scanning. Where are the threats? What's happening? Now, if you do that, again, within these cultural contexts of little t, big T traumas, that's normal. You are trying to protect yourself or anticipate any threats. It's preparing you. Now, when it doesn't become normal is when there's no external threat, but internally and psychologically, you are still experiencing it as a threat. And that moves us into, if you've heard, the fight or flight or freeze response. Has anybody heard of that? Fight, flight, freeze response. Now, this occurs in adults and teens and children. And so let's talk about each one so that you have an understanding. And ask yourself as I'm describing them, is this me? Do I do this? And what situations does this occur? The freeze response. As the brain measures the extent of the threat, so if somebody is yelling at you or you're in an intense environment and your brain is going and it's frozen, it's figuring out what's happening and it heightens your senses, but it may cause you to freeze. So sometimes your partner, when they're yelling and you freeze and they get upset with you, your partner needs to understand that their emotional intensity is causing what's called emotional flooding because it triggers childhood trauma where maybe you were yelled at and then you freeze. So it's about your partner walking away or someone walking away to give you space, or you telling your partner, I need space to walk away, and your partner hopefully will allow you to do that so your brain and your nervous system can get regulated again. So that's the freeze response. How many people who are on this live engage in this freeze response where you just can't think, you're frozen, you can't move? Anybody experience the freeze response? All right, let's move on to the flight response. This is where the muscles tense up in preparation to run. So you may be in a situation where, again, intensity, something's happening. You don't even wait. There's no freezing for you. You're already out the door. This sometimes can happen when you are in, thank you, Mira. Is that the flight response or the freeze response? Many of us growing up in these intense household environments, we will freeze. Or we will, thank you, Mira. Yes, the freeze response. The flight response is when you retreat to your room. You avoid, you go away, you leave. So you may leave a relationship when it becomes too emotionally connected. So this is how the trauma, because of earlier attachment trauma, someone can feel really connected to you. And guess what? You're running for the hills because you're like, too much, too much. Now, this is usually my response. So if anyone, it's the fight response. When you're in a situation where you feel threatened, and it could be anything, someone giving you feedback, traffic, could be a family member saying something to you. You could be in a work situation and they try and take credit for your work, and you immediately go in, you're like, I'm going to fight. Inside, not that you actually do that, but in some cases, you start yelling and you start fighting people. We're trying to minimize that. This is where your heart rate starts to pump, your respiratory function starts to speed up, and your body is preparing to confront the danger. So if you come at me, I'm going to come at you 10 times more. Now, growing up, at least within my cultural family system, fighting was normal. And so a lot of it was, I learned through modeling that you respond to emotional issues with fighting. And that was very much normal. Anybody do the fight response? We have I call this the feisty culture. In a lot of ways, we're very, very quick to jump or quick to react. Anybody have the fight response in this? All right. So now let's keep going. Anybody that wants to join in, we're talking about the freeze, flight, fight. So far, these three, think about where do you lie in this? The next one is the fright response. Okay. This is where intense fear takes over in response to a sense of helplessness. And this reduces your ability to think clearly. So if you've heard the phrase, the deer in the headlights, and the deer, that's that freeze, right? And it's frightened. And so the ability for you to think when you're at that heightened, fearful state, people will say, well, why couldn't they just do this? Or why couldn't they do that? Or I would have done this. And there's all this judgment around when someone is frozen and they're afraid and they feel helpless and they can't move through something. Well, that's the fright response that's occurring within them. Or children that may be frightened and they feel helpless. And this could have been you growing up. And then your parents expected you to do something, but you were so afraid. Think about that. When you're afraid and there's a child and they're afraid and you're asking them to think clearly, where is our compassion? And physiologically, it hijacks the cognitive functioning of the brain. So they're not able to in that moment until we can help them regulate their nervous system. There's the flag response. Now, this is where the body system begins to shut down. So if you have a numbing of emotions, so people will say, I don't know if it's a trigger. A lot of Arab that I work with will talk about, I don't know. There's a numbing within me, a numbness. I can't feel the emotion. How do I know it's a trigger or not? Well, part of that is you've learned so much to shut down your system that now your ability to feel emotions is compromised. So it's asking yourself daily, sometimes every minute, what am I feeling? Sometimes I have to give the feelings wheel, because the range of feelings within our culture in general is so limited. Like our range of emotion can be very, very, depending on your family system. Couldn't be too happy, couldn't be too sad, couldn't be too angry, couldn't be too upset, and it was very limited. So you may have, well, maybe you're feeling melancholy, or maybe you're feeling, I don't know, uplifted in some way, but you can't connect with that because you're so used to being shut down. Thank you. I think it's Hanas22166. Thank you. I'm glad this is resonating. And if you feel comfortable, please share what part of what I'm saying resonates. Now, in extreme cases, there's another response, which is the body responses to trauma sometimes faints. So I know growing up at funerals, I would see aunties fainting at the death of a loved one. And that is in this extreme case where their trauma is so severe and their central nervous system's response is so intense that the body faints. So when you see this, many times we judge people for freezing or running or fighting or being afraid. We are always confused with our emotions. We are confused with our emotions because, there's something in my eye. Because growing up, when you had an emotion, what were you told? Don't feel that way. What you're feeling isn't true. Ma'alash, insu, tehkush. You're confused with your emotions because many of us growing up, we weren't even allowed to have emotions. Forget about it. That's right. We were not. And so you ask yourself as an adult, how come my emotions are so confused? Well, guess what? Oh, yes. Haram to feel. Thank you, Raven. Haram to feel this way. How come you're feeling this way, Ashan? These other people, they have it worse. That one as a clinician drives me a little upset. That's where my fight response comes out, right? It's my experience for me, for the context of my life, is difficult. Does it mean somebody else? Of course, we can always find somebody who has it worse. Always. But for you in your life, do not minimize your feelings. It's haram for you to feel sad when look at how much worse other people have it. Well, yes, both can be true. So what? We're going to suffer in the same way other people suffer when you don't have to? No. I'm sorry. That's not helping them, and it's not helping us as a community. All right. So let me review real quick. Freeze, flight, fight, fright, fear, flag. The flag response is you're numbing your emotions. And many times we numb our emotions with substances, food, alcohol, drugs, because childhood trauma and substance use and eating related disorders are tied typically. So ask yourself, when I'm shutting or numbing my emotions, am I binge eating to suppress? Am I using substances? What am I doing to numb these? What emotions am I even numbing? Okay. So our nervous systems. So now let's kind of move into, for the sake of time. Okay. I think the one guy said, well, what's the solution? Let's talk about your nervous system. No matter where you, actually, I want to talk about symptoms of trauma real quick. If you are feeling flashbacks of any pain or suffering that you had, any confusion or difficulty focusing, nervousness and overwhelm in everyday situations. So you know how within our culture, sometimes our parents or family members would freak out over the smallest of things? They would make what we say a mountain out of a molehill. Please remember that this may be attributed to their trauma response. It's like, بحطوا الكاسة من hand لهand, and then the auntie, yay, شو سويتوا? Right? And they freak out. And then you as a kid are like, what's going on? The cup was just moved from here to there. Why are they freaking out? Well, as an adult, when you see that, instead of saying, Mom, why are you making it such a big deal? Stop making this a big deal. You say, Mom, I know this is hard. How can I help you? Or what can I do? Or these are things that we can help co-regulate with one another. That's why in your healing, you can impact the healing of your families and your communities, because you will be the model. Now, it's a burden. I'm not going to, and it's, are you alone? Are you isolated? Yeah, that's why I created this community. So you're not so alone. But it's alone. When you're on this path of healing, it can feel very isolating. But remember, again, this overwhelm in everyday situations could be your trauma response. Difficulty enjoying activities. Many times I hear the culture, it's so negative. Everything is just gloom, doom, and destruction. And I get it. When you look at everything that's happening, you're like, how can we, but yet we can find joy. Yet the overarching, because of all these threats, we may not be able to access joy fully in everyday life things. And that may be attributed to the little T's that have occurred throughout your life, and of course the larger T's. Guilt and shame, aggression. This is a huge one where there's rage. You see lots of people in our community raging, or within our families. This is trauma response. No one taught any of us how to regulate our emotions. Emotional numbness. You can't get out of bed. You don't want to function. You're hiding. You're avoiding. This is all normal. This is your body saying, I don't want to go out there and deal with that because it's too much. So you avoid, you stay away from people, places, and things that trigger your trauma. Now, when you're living in the countries that I mentioned, even if you rebuild, the trauma is still all around you. The triggers are still there even after you rebuild. So what do you do with that? To be honest, I'm going to leave that to the experts in those countries. I don't even feel remotely equipped to even talk about that. I could say here in the United States, within our cultural Middle Eastern context, it's to say, yes, you can theoretically stay away, but if your abuser is in your family, you could do minimal contact, and that's for another live. Sometimes in extreme cases, we will see suicidal thoughts. Now, many times you may not want to kill yourself. Many times you do not want to harm yourself. It could be your brain is so overwhelmed that it has thoughts of not wanting to be here. And please, if any of you have these thoughts, to call your respective emergency or go to the nearest hospital, go get the help. And know that we are here to support you no matter what happens or what you're going through. You are being held and seen and heard, that you are not alone. As long as this community and with the community is here, you are never alone. Never. Okay? Because our healing, as I heal, this healing goes to you. The more you heal, the healing goes to somebody else. We heal each other. The more each and every one of us heals, this energy, this goes out to all those around us. And it's hard. It's a path that is very challenging. However, it is a path that I believe in, because what other alternative do we have? To stay stuck, to stay angry, to stay hidden? No, we have a beautiful culture that is so much alive. And so how can we continue that even in the midst of everything? Now, when I got to tell you guys, as we're finishing this up, the culturally responsive mental health services for our community is minimal. I have a community of therapists that I'm reaching out to. Thank you, younger generation, for going into the mental health field. 25 years ago, it was like me. This was in San Francisco. It was like me and like 3 other people. That's it. So thank you, young people, for going into the field and supporting our communities in that healing. I, as an older therapist and Arabiya, really appreciate you guys because we need more culturally appropriate treatment options. And not all the treatment options that are out there are appropriate for everyone. And then, of course, the stigma around mental health services within our culture is still very, very high. You're weak. What other things? You're majnoon or majnoona. Or how come you can't figure this out on your own? No, you can't. I mean, can you? Maybe. But it's very, very hard. Now, the trauma I see is this defeatist attitude. Even I think I did a live on this not that long ago where I said, I'm starting this project and the people in my life were like, Majnoona, the Arab don't change. This very defeatist attitude. And I'm like, no, we start small with acknowledgement and awareness that we are dealing with very intense circumstances, very intense, very multi-layered. And then what? Yani, we're expected to just figure this out? No, that's ridiculous. So how do we heal? So let's take a minute. Our nervous systems need rest and reset. So I did a video not that long ago on no matter where you are in the world, how can you give yourself permission to rest? And sometimes that's the Arabi finesse. I need time. Arabi finesse is sometimes we have to tell our parents, I'm studying, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, so that you can take some time out for yourself to restore all this that you're inputting and expending through people pleasing, through working hard. You need to rest your body and your mind. How you do that through anything that brings you joy, art, poetry, music, making videos, building things. My teta would she would do knitting. These are things, tetrias, right? Building things. You know, we have a lot of people in our culture who are very mechanical and they like to build things. That again is, where do you channel? How do you find your rest? Now, rest is not only through meditation, yoga, all these Western things. No, it could be through you doing something that you enjoy. But how many times within our culture do we give ourselves permission to do the things that we enjoy? What do we get if we're resting? Kaslane, or you're lazy, or get up, or you have to be doing something. Maybe you're going out to go enjoy yourself, and then they're telling you no. And this is where you find your creative ways to get that rest. If you don't rest, if your nervous system stays overactivated over time, it can be very complicated. If you don't have the energy to do anything when your nervous system is depressed, it's about movement. And that could be just rolling out of bed or getting off the couch, standing up and stretching. And you start there. It's about movement. When you're anxious and your nervous system is revved up, it's about resting, taking a nap. Now, when you're in bombs and intense environments, how do you find this rest and reset? And again, I am going to defer that to, I'm not sure what's happening with the live. Something's happening with the live. I don't know if you guys can still hear me. Okay, can you guys still hear me? Okay, so we're gonna finish up. Music, chanting, dance, movement. This is where thank you. This is where we come together through our indigenous rituals and practices, sharing in a meal. And this is how we heal through spirituality or prayer. That could be your piece. Humming. I love humming. So you could be in line at the grocery store. You could be and just hum. The brain cannot think when you're humming. So humming can also be very effective. Reach out to the people in your community that you can feel that safety and connection. Who are those people? And if you don't have people in your family, are there friends? Is there a shopkeeper? Is there someone that you could feel safe with and connected? Find those people. And I hope for many young people, or for the people that are in this community for International Arab, my hope is that this community can also give that to you. So these are a couple of things. I do have a workshop coming up in January around the autonomic nervous system and ways to gain an understanding of that and more tools around that. We're an incredibly resilient culture, incredibly resilient. And let's shift our strength from shutting down, doing what we know, to opening up our minds and our hearts to recognize that our healing comes from expression of emotion in healthy ways versus suppression of emotions and internalized stress. I wanted to thank everyone for joining me on this live today. I wish you all a very wonderful day in how you move forward. Remember, you are not alone. We are together. Let us heal our trauma and walk away from this with one thing. You can heal through understanding. Thank you, everyone.